Hey friends, it's Anna and welcome to another cozy journaling sesh. I read some really interesting books in August, quite a variety of genre and vibes, so I can't wait to discuss these books with you all while we create my reading journal spreads for each of them. Grab some tea or coffee, get cozy, and let's start journaling. I always start off my reading journal recaps with a cover page and a stat spread with a little reading summary for each month, so that's what I'm beginning to create in these first two pages. I'm using some tea stain paper, which I'll eventually write my title on, and then I'm also going to paste in part of a page from an old Harry Potter book. These old yellowed pages in the book match really well with the tea stain paper, and both of these are perfect for creating that vintage academia vibe that I like having in my journal. I do stain this tea stain paper myself, so I'll leave a link below to the tutorial video I use from Plant-Based Bride. Now that it's fall, I'm going for a more autumnal color palette, so I'm going to be using two main washi tapes, both from the washi tape shop. This first one is the caffeine canvas, which is all coffee themed, and next we have the dusty blue and cinnamon tape with all these beautiful florals. I'll leave a link to these tapes and all the supplies I'm using in this setup below in the description box, and I'm also an affiliate with the Washi Tape Shop, so you can always use my code ANNABRUNS10 for 10% off your entire order over there if you want to check out either of these tapes. I love this caffeine set so much. All these coffee themed paintings are so pretty, and I also feel like coffee is a very fitting theme for a reading journal. Sitting in a cafe with a hot cup of coffee and a stack of books to read on a fall Saturday morning, that's the vibe I'm going for. So I'm using my X-Acto knife and cutting mat to peel off the sections of these tapes that I want to add to the collage, and I'm going to use my alphabet stamp set to add the title on the tea stain paper. To finish off the spread, I'm going to add a few more things below this title. You saw me playing around a lot with different placements for the washi tape. That's the fun thing about this collage style journaling. You don't really have to plan it out exactly, but can just test out pictures in a bunch of different spots until it looks good. I'm pulling some scrapbook paper from a few of these little collections I got on Amazon. Again, trying out a few different ones. I really do love the color palette we'll be using in these pages, which I kind of chose based on the dusty blue and cinnamon tape. The floral touches still make it reminiscent of summer, but the warmer tones are perfect for the changing of the seasons. Now for one of the last steps on the cover page, I'm pulling out this vintage florals silicone stamp set, and I'm going to add a few stamps to the second scrapbook paper here. I only recently got these stamps, but they're perfect for creating a vintage aesthetic and also just filling in any empty space. Finally, I'm going to cut out a few of these smaller florals from the washi tape to scatter around the page and kind of tie it all together, and that will complete our cover page. Now on the right side here, I'm going to create a little summary for the month of August. I'll paste in covers for each of the books I read and list out 4 different stats. I find the pictures for the book covers on Goodreads and use Google Docs to resize and print them so they're all the same height. I also like to use pictures of the covers I specifically read the book in. So for example, you might recognize this isn't the most common edition of Mistborn, but it's the one I have, and luckily Goodreads has a section where you can look at more editions and see their book covers as well. So I use that feature. I'm pasting in all the covers and drawing a double box to make them stand out a bit more, and this top section is where I'm going to write out some stats. I'm going to put them on some more pieces of scrapbook paper, and before I start writing them out, I'm going to add some more washi tape and collage elements around. I also like tearing the edges of these scraps to make it look a little more worn. I'm using this circle of flowers as a border for a little header that I'm stamping out, 5 books for the 5 books I read last month, and I'll go over it with my fine liner to make it bolder. I'm using the stamp set to title each of the reading stats as well before writing out the numbers. Sometimes I make graphs for the monthly stats, but I felt like this page already had a lot going on, so we're doing something simpler and just writing them out. The first stat is genre. The majority of books I read last month were fantasy with 3 books, and then 1 historical fantasy and 1 mystery. Babel was my historical fantasy, and I felt like it really was more historical fiction than fantasy, so that's why I wanted to call it out as a subgenre of fantasy. Next we have format, so how I read the book. I read 2 of these in their physical copies, listened to 2 of them on audio, and did a combination of reading and listening for 1 of them. Next is rating, and I had 1 5-star book, 2 4-star books, and 2 3-star books. So it was a pretty good reading month overall. Lastly, I have a stat that tracks how long I spent reading each book. So you can see here I had 2 books that I read for about a month and 3 books that took me 1 to 2 weeks to complete. I love geeking out over these stats each month, and at the end of the year, I also look at these stats for all the books I read that year, so I get an average rating and what genre I read most and how long I'm reading each book for on average and all that really interesting information, which is so fun to look at. If you guys have any additional reading stats that you keep track of, let me know because I love having a record of these and it'd be fun to keep track of even more things. I'm adding a few more things to the collage here. I'm going to highlight the stat titles, and those are my completed cover pages. Now we're getting into the spreads I make for each individual book. Each book will get its own page or half page depending on how much I have to write about it or how I want to decorate the spread. I can't wait to discuss these books with you guys while I journal because there's a lot of really popular books in here that I'm sure some of you have read. We're starting out with Babel by R.F. Kuang, the author of the Poppy War trilogy and Yellowface, neither of which I've read, so this was my first book by her. The premise of this book was honestly genius. It's historical fantasy set at the University of Oxford in the 19th century. Like I mentioned earlier, it felt more historical fiction than anything. We get a lot of the history and discussions on 19th century Britain, colonialism, the Industrial Revolution, racism, but there's also a magic system involving the use of silver, and the act of translation is what powers the silver, so linguistics plays a huge part in the story too. Our main character is Robin Swift, a Chinese native who is adopted and brought up in Britain so he can study at Oxford's prestigious translation center called Babel. There were a lot of things I think this book did really well, and some things I think it did really poorly. The setting, the dark academia vibes were fantastic, and I thought the writing was well done. Again, I loved the premise. I thought it was such a clever idea to come up with a magic system that could represent the Industrial Revolution and colonization so that we could tackle those themes in a fantasy book. But honestly, the execution is what fell short for me. The author is obviously extremely knowledgeable about these topics, so it was interesting from a historical perspective, and I actually enjoyed learning about linguistics and translation as well, but all the fiction aspects weren't great. The world building, the character development, the magic system, the plot and pacing. This book was so long and it felt like nothing happened until the very end. A lot of it was just pretty heavy-handed lecturing, which I don't mind if I've intentionally picked up a nonfiction book, but when I'm reading fiction, I want to explore themes through the storyline of a character. That's the unique opportunity with fiction. I will never have the live experience of being a Chinese-born man living in Britain in the 19th century, but in imagining that perspective through the eyes of our main character, that could be such a cool vehicle to tackle the themes in this book. But instead of using storytelling to put the readers in a new perspective and then letting us come to our own conclusions, I felt like the author still just told us what she wanted us to know and to think, and then told us again in case we missed it the first time. So that was a little annoying, but I still gave this book 3 stars. It was a really interesting idea. There was definitely promise. I know this book was insanely popular last year, so let me know if you've read it and what you thought. Next up, we have Death on the Nile by the Queen of Mystery, Agatha Christie. And by the way, did you guys know, I just learned this, that Agatha Christie herself went missing for like a week, and it's still a mystery to this day what happened to her during that time? I just thought that was so crazy that our Queen of Mystery has her own mysterious past. But anyways, Death on the Nile was my book club's latest read. It's another Hercule Poirot novel, and it takes place on an Egyptian cruise down the Nile when one of the passengers is murdered. I didn't love this one as much as The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. That's the only other Christie book I've read, but it was still really good, so I gave it 4 stars. I love her writing and the way she sets up her mysteries because she points out certain clues, like she's trying to help the reader out in solving the murder, which makes guessing the ending even more fun throughout the novel and made for great discussion in our book club. We were like, okay, she's pointed out the nail polish so many times, we know it's important, but what does it mean? I am proud to say I did guess the murderer in this one, but I was still very off in some of the key details. I would love to read more Agatha Christie books, maybe this fall. I don't read a lot of mysteries, but I feel like they're perfect for October and spooky season. So leave your favorite Agatha Christie recommendations for me in the comments to help me decide which one to read next. Flipping over to our last pages, this next spread is for the first book in the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. I think the first book is technically called The Final Empire, but it says Mistborn on the edition I have, so that's the title I'm using here. I've been wanting to read this series for so long. I've heard so much about Brandon Sanderson as an amazing fantasy author, and this was actually a buddy read with both my husband and one of our friends who is a big Sanderson fan and had already read this series. I definitely feel like this is a great book to read with friends because there's so much in the plot and world to talk about, and my husband and I had a lot of fun coming up with theories and guessing how it would end. The story is a high fantasy set in the realm of the Lord Ruler, an immortal dictator who rules through oppression and an iron fist, and we follow 2 street thieves who dare to lead a rebellion. I really enjoyed this book for so many different reasons. First, the characters. There's this amazing dynamic with their crew of criminals in the underground. You guys know I'm a very character-driven reader, so I loved all the attention we got to really developing our 2 main characters and also the personalities of everyone else in the crew. The magic system and the overall world were so imaginative and unique. It all made sense, but you can also tell there's still so much lore to uncover in the future books. The plot was really fun as well. There's a lot of scheming and political intrigue, infiltrating the nobility. This was definitely a high 4 stars. It took me a little bit in the beginning to get through the initial setup and world building before I was hooked, but I loved the second half of the book and I'm so excited to continue the series. I have already started book 2. I feel like this definitely has the potential to be a 5-star series, so stay tuned. I'm planning on reading the rest of the series this fall. Moving over to our last page, I'm going to split this page in half for 2 book spreads. The top section will be for Powerless by Lauren Roberts. You've probably heard of this one or read it yourself because this has been a really popular fantasy romance. The story is set in a world of elites who have powers and ordinaries who do not. And in order to maintain a strong society of elites, the king has banished all ordinaries. So our main characters are Peyton, who is an ordinary surviving as a street thief and trying to hide her true identity, and Kai, who is the prince and enforcer, which means it's his job to hunt and kill ordinaries. So obviously we have an enemies to lovers situation, and there's also a Hunger Games-esque competition that they both get thrown into, which I'm not going to try to explain because it doesn't make much sense to me. This was one of those books where I enjoyed it, even though I thought it was kind of bad, but I knew exactly what I was getting into and it delivered on what I wanted it to be. It was a fun, no brain power romance set in a fantasy world, and I could listen to it on audio while doing other things. The plot and world were, to me, pretty underdeveloped and honestly not that interesting, but the book did keep me entertained, mainly through the romance. I did really enjoy the romance, especially getting both characters' POVs, but I will say it was incredibly cliched with every overused trope imaginable. But there is a reason authors use those tropes. It's because they're fun to read about, even if I was rolling my eyes half the time. So overall, it wasn't my favorite romantasy because the fantasy aspects were a bit lacking, but if you love the fantasy romance genre, and if you're a fan of the tall, dark, handsome, morally gray enemies to lovers, this will definitely deliver on every beloved cliche. So as you can see, the last spread in this setup is for the first Harry Potter book, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. If you've been following along with me, you guys know I am a huge Harry Potter fan, and I have been since I was in elementary school and read these books for the first time. I usually reread these every year, which I know is a bit over the top, but they're such a comfort read to me, so I've started the series again. Since I've read these books so many times though, and have already done reading journal spreads for each of them, instead of doing my normal format where I journal my thoughts, I'm just adding some decorations around the book cover. I thought it would be fun this year to do a theme of Hogwarts classes, so for each book I'm going to make the spread based on a different class. I chose charms for the first one because I thought it'd be fun to include Hermione's iconic quote. I'm adding a little 3/4 after the 9, if you know you know, and that completes my August reading wrap up. We'll do a final flip through of all the spreads. I'm so happy with how these pages turned out, and as always, I had so much fun discussing these books. Please let me know if you've read any of these and what your opinions were. I would love to discuss more in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching, and happy reading!